I'd like to welcome you this evening to our special presentation of Ungardening with Aubree Keurajian. And just a few announcements. This is the Lewisboro Garden Club, and we're working with the Lewisboro Library, and we will probably be doing Zoom presentations for a number of meetings to come. Community is always invited, and these are free. Okay, this evening's presentation, if you have questions as Aubree goes along, if you write them in the chat, we'll kind of monitor them, and if we can, we'll answer them as we go along. Some we may save until the end. You'll stay unmuted until that time, and Aubree will be sharing her screen. Her talk this evening is, I had heard her back at the Norwalk River Water Association. That was also a Zoom, and I was very impressed and felt she was really in line with what the Garden Club is trying to do, and I believe is good for our community. She's striving to bring scientifically sound ecological advice for all gardeners to help so that they are able to help the environment. Many things we do disrupt the flow between our gardens and the wild ecosystem. So she will speak to how we can address that imbalance. And without further ado, Aubree.
Hi. So, sharing. Hi. So thanks so much to the Lewisboro Library and the Lewisboro Garden Club for having me. And as Rose said, my talk is an introduction to the concept of ungardening. And really the focus is on building your yard's connection with nature. So I'm going to start just a little bit with who am I? So for about 13 years, I did a whole lot of this. I got real lucky with having some great environmental educators all through school who really, and wonderfully supportive parents who really nurtured a sense of wonder and awe about the world around me. And eventually that led to me enrolling at Cornell University, where I studied the science of natural and environmental systems, which is kind of a wordy way of saying systems ecology or even natural resources. And after that, I did what's pretty typical for someone with a bachelor's degree like that, is I did the field technician thing for a few years. So I worked out west in the public sector doing arid land restoration and seed collection through a program called Seeds of Success. And then I also worked for Duke and Indiana universities in forest ecology labs. And I really believed what I was going to go into academia. But in the midst of that, as much as I love research and I know how important it is for us to understand the world around us from that level, I saw the rate of change of the environment around me and really wanted to do something that was a lot more hands-on and was helping people make moves on their own. So I moved back to Connecticut. I got a job working at Davison Environmental, which is an environmental firm doing botanical surveys and things like that. But more relevant for us here tonight, I started Ungardening native plants, which is both a small-scale native plant nursery as well as a yard consultation service. So what that means is that I go out to people's yards and I identify the plants that are growing there already, what's native that they might not know, what's invasive that should be dealt with, and then how to manage your land in a different way so that instead of it being kind of an outdoor room that's divorced from the rest of the planet, it's a functional part of the environment and kind of your own personal national park. So who are these pollinators? A lot of us, when we think of pollinators, this is the first buddy that we think of, the little honeybee. But the honeybee is actually more similar to the dairy cow than to our pollinators. It's a domesticated animal. The wild ones are feral. They are not native here. So these honeybees, even though they're the focus of a lot of conversation, and that's really important, and they're incredibly important to our foodways, what they need is not what our native pollinators need. And actually in this picture, they're on a crabapple. So that's not a native species as well. And because we have so many non-natives, they kind of create an ecology that exists on top of our natural ecology. So who are these other pollinators? Well, we all know about the monarchs. They're incredibly charismatic, and there's lots of other butterflies that are they forage on plant matter as juveniles, and then as adults, they feed on nectar of a variety of different species. And we know the monarch and its close relationship with milkweed. But as you can see, this adult here is feeding on Newark ironweed. So those associations aren't quite as tight and as one-to-one as we think they are. But it's not just bumblebee or honeybees and butterflies. This is a yellow jacket. Wasps, now yellow jackets are a bit of a special case. This is actually a European yellow jacket that is invasive, but he was posing nice for the picture. She was posing nice for the pictures. But many wasps are incredibly important pollinators, and only a very few wasps and bees actually form the colonies and those hives that we know of. Most of them are solitary and are actually very timid, and are very unlikely to sting you. There are actually some big, large wasps that you can even pet because they would never think to sting you, because that's just not in their nature. There are also flies that are pollinators. Even our regular housefly that you're used to seeing all the time is a quite important pollinator on a lot of species. Of course, bumblebees and tons of other native species of bees. This guy, you look at him and you might think he's a bee because of these little stripes, but this is actually a bee mimic fly. So when we hear the word fly, we think of the housefly and maybe even these shiny little guys, but there's tons of flies, and a lot of them are things that we have a positive association with already. Here's a little housefly on this virgin's bower. Ants are pollinators too, and so are beetles. And pollinators, of course, are not adults when they're born. So I mentioned a little bit with the monarch and the milkweed. So here's a monarch caterpillar eating some swamp milkweed. So that's another interesting thing. Milkweed is a genus, and there are many species. So as gardeners, sometimes we're only familiar with one or two plants of a group. So get ready to really broaden your horizons when you start looking at native plants. All right, and this is an interesting picture here. So this caterpillar is an eastern tiger swallowtail, and this plant that it's on, Queen Anne's lace, a lot of people absolutely adore, and I constantly am having people ask me if I sell it. It's not native, but that doesn't mean it's bad. Queen Anne's lace is not invasive, and as you can see here, it's a food source for a native pollinator. So the question of native, non-native, invasive is a lot more complicated than we kind of think that it is at first dash. So there's a lot more than just food as an adult or as a child that these pollinators need. So I'm going to get into that. This is a forest, and there's a lot more than just food in this forest, right? So we've got leaf litter down here that has tons of habitat in it. We've got dead trees that are habitat up in higher levels that are, because they decompose more slowly, are able to be a host for a lot of different forms of life. So what are these forms of life? Oh, sorry, my pictures are a little out of order. So this is a plant called world loosestrife. And this is a really unique example of something other than pollen or food or just regular food that an insect needs. These plants, there's 4 or 5 in the genus native to Connecticut. I'm not sure exactly about New York. They produce oils in addition to the pollen, but their primary product that attracts insects to them are these oils, and they are pollinated by this one kind of bee that the males will collect these oils and then use them as almost a perfume to attract the females. And this is something that's super common in tropical areas, and the bees down there will actually create bouquets from many different species of flower. But up here, we just have this one genus that engages in this really unique ecology. And some plants, what they need for their nutrients doesn't just come from the soil. They require an active insect ecology to survive. So these are sundews, which are a carnivorous plant that are native here. And just like the Venus flytrap, they digest insects in order to get their nutrients because they live in a very nutrient-poor environment. And plants also create a physical structure in an environment that the insects are then able to come into and create a more functional habitat that is not just a pretty bunch of flowers for butterflies to come and feed off of, but there are animals able to live their entire lives in that space. Animals as big as mammals. and animals as small as beetles. So when you clean up your garden and you take away all of the dead matter, you're preventing all of these insects from having a home. And those insects are the food for birds and other more charismatic insects that you might want in your garden, but you're not going to be able to get those if you don't have these foundational pieces. And once you have a really healthy and functioning ecosystem, you'll get incredible fungi coming in. So both of these pictures, they're not taken in yards, but they are taken in forests that were not so long ago farmland. So it doesn't have to be an incredibly old growth forest for chanterelles to grow. And you can, with the right management, have those things potentially come into your yard. Oh, there's another fun little mushroom. All right, so what is an ungarden and why do we want, and I just kind of discussed the reasons of why we want to, the things that we can bring into our property when we create this. So what is an ungarden? An ungarden is not just a place where you've planted native plants, but it's a place where you're trying to replicate what's going on in nature. So you may have heard not to pick up your leaves at the end of the fall and to leave them on your garden, because that's an incredibly important habitat for overwintering solitary bees, as well as many moths and butterfly caterpillars as well. So the way that when you're looking at your property and you're trying to figure out exactly how to move onward and to go beyond just those flowers that are there, what you're going to first do is designate an area. And I'm going to go over this pretty briefly because I want to get to something else, and then I'm going to come back to this. So you're going to designate your area. You're going to just let it grow for a while. You're going to learn those plants, and then you're going to garden by subtraction. And I'm going to jump over this because I need to first talk about invasive plants. So when we're talking about kind of letting things go to allow for more habitat to come into our environment, if you've spent any time at all in any sort of place that's been let go, you know that there are plants there that we don't want. And an invasive plant is not the same as a weed. And sometimes those words get used interchangeably. But in our gardens, the plants that function as weeds are simply the plants that we don't want to be there. That's different than the plants that are acting as invasive species. So invasive species is defined specifically by a plant's role in the wild environment. Invasive species are non-native species that outcompete native species and produce ecosystems that are less biodiverse than the native ecosystems that exist there. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples because some of them you probably are going to recognize as invasive plants and some you're probably going to recognize as garden species. So this one first here is honeysuckle. There are vine and shrub honeysuckles, and they are both invasive. A lot of these plants, as we're going to go through, this is autumn olive. This is another one that was widely planted. It has beautiful flowers and wonderful berries, but unfortunately is very, very aggressive. This here is periwinkle or vinca or myrtle. Again, another one that you probably know lots of people who have this in their garden. This is burning bush. Again, another plant that was widely intentionally planted. And a lot of things, you're maybe starting to see a pattern. A lot of these plants were planted on purpose. And it wasn't because we were trying to harm the environment. We just didn't take the time to think about the interactions that these plants have with other plants and with the environment. So this is the bush honeysuckle. This one here, mile a minute vine, another one that it has incredible blue berries. So people love it and plant it. But we need to go beyond planting things just because we like them and actually consider the roles that these plants will have in the environment. So this is wineberry. This one here that I skipped over is Japanese stilt grass. This one is called Yorkshire fog or velvet grass. Phlox is not this. This is Dame's rocket. And this is one of my biggest pet peeves. This plant blooms about a month sooner than phlox, and I often have people reaching out to me and asking if I want to come collect their phlox seed. Dame's rocket is extremely aggressive and it's easily recognized because it has 4 petals, whereas phlox has 5. PHLOX, 5 petals, 5 letters. This is a member of the mustard family. And this brings me to a really cool point. Almost all members of the mustard family are edible. So, and a lot of invasive species are edible as well. So these are a great edible flower that you can add to salads and things. And that's a really neat thing to consider when you're working with these invasive species. So this is one of our few invasive sedges. And this is one that is a really tough point. So these beach roses were planted widely to stabilize the dunes and prevent erosion. And we thought we were doing something that was ecologically beneficial, but in reality, it had the opposite effect. So just because we can't get caught up in the guilt of invasive species, because then we'll just get stuck and not move onward. And there's lots of resources online. I don't really have time tonight to get into how to remove invasive species. But working on identifying what's there is really the first step, because these plants, it's not just that they aren't supporting our native flora and fauna, they are actually harming them. So, oh, and garlic mustard, if you spent any time doing remediation work, you certainly know of garlic mustard. All right, so just a couple other ones. This here is Asiatic Day Flower. This one is pale swallowwort, or a dark swallowwort. There's also pale swallowwort. This is a really interesting case. Monarch butterflies will lay their eggs on this plant. It is in the same family as milkweed, but then those eggs will not be able to develop properly. And it's actually quite actively harming our efforts to restore monarch butterflies. And privet, once those hedges aren't being maintained well, does expand into the wild and create very dense thickets. And this is one that a lot of people get really upset when they find out is invasive, but Rose of Sharon are unfortunately quite aggressive. And of course, mugwort and purple loosestrife. But anyway, let's move on to some happier plants and go back to the concept of an ungarden. So when you're looking at your property and you're trying to decide how to make more habitat, there's a couple ways that you can choose an area. So one thing I like to do, especially this time of year, you're thinking about last year and where you used your yard, and especially this past year, we've been spending a lot more time on our properties. Undoubtedly, there are areas that just made you mad, that you never spent any time over there. It was hard to mow, the ground was wet. So take those areas that are already a frustration for you, and those are great places to decide to make your own garden. Or to just, you can choose areas that you've already started to let go. And then once you've designated that area, and especially if you live in a suburb, literally distinguishing it and designating it is going to be really important. So you can use fencing, you can use just a weed whacker or a mow line and just determine your sharp spot that you want it to be. You can use rocks. That's been one of my favorites. So just positioning a row of rocks around the area. Some way to show that what you're doing is intentional, because a lot of people don't understand why you would want to bring native species into your yard. So showing for sure that it's intentional is a really important way to go. And then once you've designated that area, you're just going to let it grow. And this is one of the toughest things, because we like to be in control of our yards. And that's a lot of where the problem is. A lot of the micromanaging things that we do are what makes our yards out of balance with nature. So by just letting things grow, you're going to be able to start to identify them and know if they're friends or foes. You're never going to be able to identify a grass if you're constantly cutting it. But if you allow it to come to flower, you might find out that it's actually not a grass at all. It might be blue-eyed grass, which despite its name is actually a native iris with a tiny little blue flower. So you'll never know what's there if you don't let it grow. And a lot of our native species, well, they're native here. They know how to get around and translocate themselves and just appear. So in the next slide. I think it's the next slide. I'm going to show you some fun examples, some example Ungardens, and then also some really amazing plants that have just shown up when we allow them to. So the identifying plants is definitely the biggest challenge, but there's a couple tips and tricks that I want to impart to you. The first is with those invasive species, as you're working on removing them from your property, don't just learn their names and let it go there. Learn exactly how you tell that that plant is that plant. Learn maybe not the scientific names, because I know those are complicated, but at least learn the family, because plants are organized into their genus and species, but into greater families by how closely related they are to each other. And that means that those plants share characteristics. So once you're able to identify something as a mint or a mustard or a nightshade, it'll make it a lot easier. Instead of just seeing a plant and seeing a massive green with pinkish bluish flowers, you see, oh, I think that's in the daisy family. And then you're going to be able to jump from there and research and find out what you're looking at. And kind of a corollary to that, if you are an avid gardener already, which I imagine many of you as garden club members are, if you don't already know the families of the plants you're familiar with, that's a great place to start, because you know those plants. And then when you encounter a plant in the wild, you can be like, those flowers kind of look like my potatoes. And then wouldn't you know, that's horse nettle, which is in the nightshade family. So those connections and start learning to recognize them is really important. And I'm going to get into some key things to look at in a little bit. And then once you've got this messy area of native plants that you've allowed to show up, you're going to start to garden by subtraction. So the biggest thing of that is removing those invasive species. But once you've got those invasive species out, to kind of bastardize a common quote, once you've taken away everything invasive, whatever left, no matter how strange and unfamiliar, must be native. So once you've got those native plants that you have, you can decide which ones you want to keep and which ones you want to encourage and which ones you want to maybe translocate. And then you can kind of take those human instincts of creating a space that's going to appeal to your sensibilities and really let them go a little more wild. So this is an example of a habitat that is drastically in decline in Connecticut, and it's called young forest habitat. So here we've got some small trees, some shrubs, and then a lot of young herbaceous plants. And this is the habitat that the New England cottontail and a lot of our less common birds really, really need. And in the Northeast, as farms reverted into either or forest. I'm sorry, I don't know why feedback is happening. Can you still hear me? Okay. So as the farmland reverted either into forest or suburbs, we ended up with a lot of either very highly developed land and mature forests. And this whole middle category of meadows, but also these young forest environments have kind of gotten lost. So here, I just want to point out a couple fun species. This one here is called tall blue lettuce, and it's a biannual. It'll get about 15 feet tall, but the reason that it gets so tall is in order for its seeds to be spread really, really far. So when you start to ungarden and when you accept native plants back into your yard, you're going to get a lot of these really tall and kind of stereotypically weedy native species. But they're there for a reason, and that reason is to cover up the soil. You can see how incredibly dense this is. The year prior, this was almost all rose bushes. So the plants cover up the soil and prevent the invasive species from germinating or coming into that area. And then since they are so tall, and you'll notice their seeds are almost always wind dispersed like a dandelion, those seeds spread far away to where they're needed again. And over the years, this area will develop from an area of tall blue lettuce and daisy fleabanes into milkweeds and goldenrods and New York ironweed, as well as these black cherry and black walnut trees. This is an area out front. You can see we've got some rocks here in this picture. It needs to be weed whacked, but the one thing to be sure to always pay attention to is how your garden space is going to interact with the people around you. So you can't really see in this picture, but we do have about a 2.5 foot setback from the road. So that's important to keep in mind. Make sure that as you're welcoming nature back onto your property, you're not unintentionally antagonizing people. But it's really awesome to put an ungarden in the front of your property or near a road, because of those wind dispersed seeds. Just like I was saying, you can actually take advantage of the vehicles driving by to pull those seeds on the wind. If you've ever driven along the highways and noticed the common reed or other invasive species, they also get spread that way. So we can kind of take that mechanism and use it to our own advantage. This is just a shot from the other angle. And this is an example of a really small ungarden. And I know our lawn is a little wild, but the reason that we put this ungarden here is because there were wild strawberries there already. So when you're deciding where you want to turn into your wildflower meadow or your native plant area, consider what's already on your property and work with that. So there are some native plants that have been in the lawn and garden industry a long, long time. Arborvitae is one that I actually just learned this year was native. The red twig dogwood is another really common one. So if you have those on your yard, in your property already, making them the centerpiece of an ungardened or naturalistic yard garden area could be a really effective way to go. So this is a really cool plant. This is a Canada wood lily, and this friend just showed up on its own. We've been this area in our yard actually has been wild for many, many years, but I've just recently started managing it to remove invasives more intensely. And I don't know if this plant had germinated many years and just got eaten by deer, but I was able to actually fence it off and protect it and allow it to germinate. And I just absolutely blown away to be able to just have this native lily show up on its own. And then this year, so this was last spring, this year, in an area that we weren't even actively trying to ungarden, but my mother just decided hasn't been weeding as aggressively as she would in the past. I convinced her last year to leave this, and this year it bloomed. And it's a pussy willow, a native pussy willow that found its own way there to the back of our property. But and this location might not be great for it. It's a little close to our leaching field. But now that we waited long enough to know who it is, we can transplant that willow to a place that's going to be better. And there's an 8 foot tall willow that we didn't have to pay for. It just showed up right on its own. So I'm going to get into talking a little bit about how to, just a little tips and tricks for going about identifying species. I don't know if we want to pause now for a couple of the questions.
That Aubree, good. There's been a little bit of a discussion. You mentioned one genus, the Rosa Sharon.
Yes.
And you know, of course, there's back and forth about whether it's really invasive. It's not on the New York invasive list. I'm not sure. I can't check the web. I'm not sure if you can, but I believe that happens probably with a number of plants as to whether they're invasive or not. Is that an issue or?
Yeah, so invasive lists are kind of like the dictionary. They're prescriptive, or they're descriptive, not prescriptive. So they are describing the state of the world. They are not defining the state of the world. So typically the plants that get onto the invasive species list are ones that there is a economic damages made. So plants like mugwort that take over farm fields and stuff like that. I don't know particularly why Rose of Sharon is not on the invasive species list in New York, but I can tell you that in Connecticut, it is non-native and it acts like an invasive species. And by that, I mean that if you do not do anything to control it, the ground all around it will be covered in its babies, and they will be spread to a large area around them. So the definition of invasive species that most lists go by is if a plant is non-native and can translocate itself to a new area without human assistance. And in my experience, Rose of Sharon completely falls under that category.
Are there any varieties of that that are not, or would you, that's all the Rose of Sharons?
I don't know, but I can tell you that many species, many varieties of plants that have been said to be sterile have been released into the environment and reverted and no longer are sterile. That's a huge problem with the Bradford pear.
Oh, yep. Okay, thank you.
All right. Were there any other questions, or do we want to?
No, that's about it. You can go on.
So I've been talking a lot about identifying plants and recognizing them, and that's hugely overwhelming. There's about 4,000 plants here in Connecticut, more in New York. So I want to go over just some of the things to look at on a plant, because there's a lot of information that isn't relevant. So first of all, I want to just talk about the leaves. So there's two different things you want to look at when you're looking at a leaf. You want to see, is it a simple leaf like these, where you've got one leaflet and that's the entire leaf, or is it a compound leaf like these over here? So each one of these things is not a whole leaf, it's a leaflet. The leaf is actually this entire thing here. Same in this picture. This is not a leaf. This entire thing is a leaf. And this can be a little tricky of a distinction when you're looking at pictures, but in real life, when you have a plant in your hand, what I like to do is like break a leaf off, and where does it rip easily? If you were to try and rip one of these off, it would probably like tear down this whole thing here that's called a petiole. And then the other thing you want to look at with the leaves is what the edge of the leaf is. So is it smooth like this? Is it toothed like this? Does it have really fine teeth like that? The overall size of the leaf, that doesn't matter. The shade of green of the leaf, that doesn't matter. If funny little features on it, probably don't matter unless they're really, really unique. So with flowers, this is yarrow. This is one that a lot of people are familiar with. And this is not a flower. If you look at this picture here, each one of these is actually a flower. So one of the first things people often encounter when they're starting to learn how to identify plants by flowers, and especially if you're doing it from a kind of plant relationships perspective, is that things will say, well, some plants have 3 petals and some plants have 5 petals. Lots of flowers have a totally different number of petals from 3 or 5, right? Well, they don't actually. Those things that we think of as petals are actually called ray flowers, and it gets super, super complicated, super, super fast. But what you need to know is for plants like sunflowers or like yarrow, what we see as a flower is actually a composite head of many, many flowers. So that is important to look at. And one of the ways that you can look at that is if you bisect the flower. So with this rose here, we go straight down the middle and the sex parts are right in the middle. If you did that with a yarrow flower, you wouldn't get to the sex parts in the middle. So look closely at the plants when you're looking to identify them. And some flowers here have what are called irregular flowers. So that's the term that's used there, irregular. Another example. So there's a couple things when you're looking at plants that will jump out to you as a human. The color is one of them, but color is actually a really terrible, terrible way to identify plants. So what you're going to want to look at is number of things, relative relationship of things, and the shapes overall. But you're not going to want to look at the size or the color. There's some really great resources are the Go Botany website that is made by the Native Plant Trust, I believe. They've got some really wonderful keys on there that'll help you figure out what you're looking at. So one of the other ways, sorry, let me just, what time is it? One of the things that I really love to do as you're working on removing the invasive species or the non-native but not quite invasive species is to find useful things to do with them. So one of my favorites, and what this picture in the background is showing, is making guilt-free bouquets. I love picking wildflowers, but if I think too long about picking the native plants and taking them out of the ecosystem and then, well, that flower's not going to be seeds anymore, like, man, I feel bad. So by going and picking invasive or just non-native species, you're actually, you're taking something that's negative out of the environment and you're causing a net positive. Many native plant or many invasive plants and introduced plants are natural dyes or are edible. And for many of them, that's the reason that they were introduced. And I kind of just at this point want to go back a little bit to that Rosa sharing question. And there is a big category in between invasive and native. And that category is naturalized. And that's things like dandelions that are never gonna be so aggressive that they'll create a monoculture in an area, but they're not native. But they incorporate themselves into the ecosystem. They do provide food for both our domestic honeybees as well as our native generalist insects. Some non-native plants have medicinal potential that is being researched by the FDA and other research groups and organizations. And some are wonderful for wildcrafting. So you can make wreaths from bittersweet and be sure not with the berries. And there's lots of opportunities for really, really creative things. So that kind of brings me to the end of my talk. I'm getting really excited that in this coming year, we're going to be able to get outside more. I do have more information on my website, and I am currently beginning scheduling for the yard consultation season, which will begin in May.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm looking in the chat. I'm not sure if you have any questions, just put them in there if you need them. I know you got into the questions about bees, and we've been trying to do things for our pollinators. Any suggestions about anything that we might help us as we proceed?
Yeah, so one of the really important things that I kind of glossed over when I was talking about what pollinators need other than food is exactly what habitat needs. I mentioned briefly some of them that nest in the leaf litter. Other ones need access to open soil, dead wood. So by managing and kind of holding back on all that spring cleaning and leaving the dead matter in and among your flowers is really one of the most effective ways to increase those additional types of habitat that they need. But also, when we think about, so the honeybee and the monarch are kind of a great example of a generalist and a specialist. So in any group of organisms, whether it's pollinators or herbivores or even diseases, there are going to be ones that specialize and have tight relationships with one other species or a group of closely related species. And there are going to be others that are generalists and really can take advantage of anything. So by increasing the diversity of plants on your property, you can help more of those specialists. If you have a huge field of 2 flowers, you're going to help lots and lots of generalists and some specialists, but diversity is definitely key.
Okay. I do have a question. What about intentional gardening choices? For instance, I have burning bushes, euonymus. I use as property dividers and for privacy. Any suggestions for things to go on their place?
So for screening, I really, really love red cedar or any of our native conifers, because then you've got something that's year round. If it's at all of a wet area, willows grow super fast, but will stay shrubby, as will many of our dogwoods. And the benefit of our native dogwoods is that a lot of them are commercially available already. And I guess that kind of leads me to the idea of the nativars discussion.
Mhm.
And I actually have a resource on my website where I have compiled all available data on this, because it's not so easy to say that nativars aren't as good. It really entirely depends on what was changed in that plant. So you really have to look at a nativar specific basis. And I have done a little bit of a accumulation of the studies that exist, but there really aren't that many.
And the access to the list it's on your website.
It's on my website, yep, in my resources.
All right, another question. Is there ever a time where you should intentionally introduce native plants into an area if you know the environment it naturally grows in?
Absolutely. Yeah. The problem is there are a lot of the native species that are available right now either are native to North America, which doesn't really mean anything and could be like a Florida or California native, or are from seed stock that's like from somewhere else. But if you know for sure that a plant is native to that area, you can absolutely encourage that. But one kind of counterintuitive thing that I would encourage people against is planting rare or endangered plants. So I'll admit I did this too. I got excited about planting native plants. I went right onto the Connecticut list of endangered species, picked a couple of species that I could get from Prairie Moon and bought those seeds and planted them. Luckily, most of them did not actually take, because what can happen when you do that is that what's endangered when a plant is endangered, and especially when a plant is only state endangered, are the unique genetics of that state. So by taking seed from Prairie Moon, for example, in Nebraska, if those plants grown from that seed were then to hybridize with the truly native population, we could potentially swamp out the genetics that are actually rare. So stick to the common plants. Don't go and try to get sundial lupin or whatever crazy endangered native plant you can find sourced from somewhere out west.
Okay. What's your opinion of plant ID apps like Picture This? Do you recommend any specific ones?
I recommend Seek by iNaturalist.
Me too, but go ahead.
Yeah, iNaturalist itself is great too, but Seek is a little easier to wrangle. The reason that iNaturalist is awesome is that it's not just the algorithm. You post your post and then experts will verify it.
Mhm. Okay. Do daffodils have any pollinator caterpillar value?
Daffodils are, I believe they're great for honeybees. So just because honeybees aren't native doesn't mean it isn't important to support them. There actually have been studies that show that in a wild environment with no like additional planting of plants, the honeybees actually do take food away from the native bees. So leaving those non-native, non-invasive plants is actually super important and super helpful for the honeybees. And I know daffodils in particular deter squirrels. So I imagine you could use them to protect some of your native species. Now that's just an idea, but I think it's a possibility.
Okay. One of the attendees had mentioned that dandelions are important first bloomers for pollinators. Is that correct?
Yeah, especially again for the honeybees. But this time of year, yeah, it can kind of be weird. You're looking out and you're seeing native bugs flying around, but the only things blooming are daffodils and crocuses. Well, that's because you have to look up. The trees are blooming right now. And even though they don't need the pollinators to pollinate them, and that's why our allergies are so bad because there's tree pollen all in the air, that doesn't mean that those pollinators can't take advantage of that pollen anyway.
Okay. Do you recommend anything? You had mentioned myrtle. Do you recommend anything in its place?
Sorry, what was that?
What do you recommend in place of myrtle? Yeah.
So I think we kind of need to shift away from our desire for ground covers at all. So for that like nice tight something simple up against the house, I really love using ferns.
Mhm.
But like I was saying before, diversity is what we're looking for. So we don't want a plant that's going to cover an area really densely with just itself. But if you're looking for like low growing evergreen leaves, wintergreen is really great. Partridge berry is also really great. But they're not going to make that dense ground cover.
No, they won't.
Ground cover is almost a code word for invasive.
Okay. Can you say a few words about moss, like moss versus grass?
Oh,
Is
moss
that-
is wonderful. Yeah. Very few of our native grasses will grow as turf grasses. So that means that if you mow them, they're not going to grow out and make that nice turfiness. So our native grasses like to be part of a meadow. So mosses can be a great way to get that uniform coat of green. But mosses have specific requirements. They're not going to want to grow in super full sun. They need it a little moist or a little shady. So if you're really committed to a moss garden, that is not all you need to make it happen.
Okay. One of our projects, and this is our meadows person is asking, she's really good at she's trying to identify aggressive grasses when reverting from lawn to meadow. She loves wildflower and shrub ID, but I mean, she knows that, but she feels lost with grasses. So I'm not sure if you have any suggestions in that area.
So, yeah, I'll kind of answer it from two different directions. So first, one thing that's pretty interesting when you're converting from a managed turf grass lawn into a meadow, one of the things you're going to do is stop with the liming and the fertilizing. And a lot of the grasses will just get quickly outcompeted. So I don't want to say like, don't worry about identifying them, but if you know for a fact that those are your turf grasses, you know they're not native. But one book that I really love that helps with a lot of these is Wild Urban Plants of the Northeast by Peter Deltrodecki. And this book has a lot of what we typically think of as weeds, including grasses. And then they're actually, where is that book? I don't know. Lauren Brown just recently came out with a grasses, sedges, and rushes field ID that is pretty great. Grasses are super hard. If you have never worked on identifying plants before, unless you're like a really attention to detail, like engineer type, you're gonna have a real hard time. If you're gonna want to get into grass ID, you probably are gonna need to also get a botanical glossary in addition to any field guides, because there's a lot of really weird words in botany.
Could you just go through the second title that you mentioned? I have the Wild Urban Plants of the Northeast.
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to see if it's like right behind me because I've been using it for work. It's called Grasses, Sedges, and Rushes, a field guide by Lauren Brown. Illustrated by Lauren Brown. I will send you the information so you can.
Okay, great. And we can send that. It's Lauren Brown though.
Yeah. Yeah, she's a great local botanist.
And I got grasses, sedges, and
Rushes.
Rushes. That's what it is. Okay. All right, great. Let me make sure that I got to everybody. One person mentioned the fact that myrtle is deer resistant. So since many of our native plants are not, perhaps you might want to just have a little myrtle there to protect your natives. I don't know how you feel about that, but
yeah, I don't know if that would work. I know like specifically the daffodils could be, I know daffodils are effective with tulips in that way because the squirrels are underground. I don't know if coming from the surface, it's as effective, but one thing, I don't know if myrtle is quite as bad as Pachysandra, but Pachysandra actually has very high tick density often. So that's yet another reason to get rid of it. And I imagine myrtle is very similar. It's close to the house. So if you have pets, they're going through it. If there are mice, they're going through it.
I know there is a question here about, are urban plants different than forest or plants that we have here? But I was going to say, I have the book and I know that a lot of the plants that we have here I've seen in the book, but I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, what I like to refer to this book as like the field guide to the vacant lot. So it's got a lot of native species, a lot of non-native species, but it will put similar plants together. And this book does have a lot of the aggressive and kind of like scrappy grasses.
Someone mentioned Allegheny Spurge, and I know that that's the native Pachysandra, but I have mixed feelings about that, but go ahead. Any comments on that?
I'm not familiar with that one. Its name makes me suspect it might be a native for you guys in New York, but not here in Connecticut. You have a lot more species where you are.
The Allegheny Spurge, we have it at the Bartlett, and it is we've always called it a native Pachysandra, and it has very slow growing, though it is kind of slow, but it's nice.
They're not licorice. They're around the corner, and try not to eat too many because I want them for Sunday.
I think we didn't mute that person.
Wild ginger would also be a nice option for ground cover.
Oh,
I always forget about
Aubree.
it actually isn't native in Connecticut. But for you guys, it's an awesome one.
Also, Packera aurea, Packera, great ground cover. Very, it's great in the shade. It'll take partial sun. It has a pretty yellow flower, always green, and that stays low and will allow other things to grow through them. Someone mentioned Dewberry is a native ground cover. I'm just learning about.
Dewberry is great if it's in a place you're not walking. One of the scientific names for dewberry is Rubus flagellaris. Because if you walk through it without your ankles protected, it will look like you got whipped, because it is a raspberry, so it does have little thorns. But yeah, that's a great one. That there's two species, swamp dewberry, and I don't know what the other one's common name is, but one likes wetter environments and the other will grow in woodland areas.
Oh, I'll spell it, Susan, but there's a question about epidemium. What about epidemium? Epidemium? I think I've heard that. Epidemium.
I'm not sure I know epidemium.
No.
That's not ringing a bell.
Okay. All right, folks, you got 1 minute. Epidemium is an early plant. Epimedium, Epimedium for other folks. I'm not sure about that. What about hosta, non-native, invasive?
Yeah, hosta is definitely in that category of, it's not even naturalized. So I guess there's also the category of hardy, which are plants that will live in your yard, but they're not going to spread and they're not going to be aggressive. And I would call hosta hardy.
I would call them deer food, but
yeah, or chicken food.
Thoughts. Okay, I think we're going to close it here. I want to thank you, Aubree. That was very informative. We have a number of thank yous to you. And I know that thanks Cindy for her help doing the recording and getting this together, and to Liz for always posting. And I'm so glad that so many of you were able to join us. And I hope that you do go to the Ungardening site. It's a lovely site and you can get some information there. Anything you want to add? Or you're okay? You're okay.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, everybody, have a good evening.